The August 12th meeting of the East Penn Board of School Directors is hereby called to order. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. First order of business is request to address the board. I have none. So we'll move on to approval of minutes. Motion?
So moved. And second.
Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion is approved. Next we have a presentation. Would you like to introduce?
Yes, thank you. Since April of 2019, a task force in East Penn has been meeting to investigate our secondary school start time. This initial group is comprised of school and district administration, teachers, we have a student representative on the board, as well as several community members. And one of our initial tasks for our group was to review research on adolescent sleep, as well as research on school start times. We then, you might recall, in June of 2019, administered a survey to our East Penn parents, teachers, as well as our secondary students. And so this evening, we have representatives from our task force who will provide the board and the community with where we are in terms of an update on our research. And then we will identify challenges that will need to be considered when contemplating changes in school start time. And then we're also going to conclude by sharing with you the next steps in our work. I want to note for both the board and the community that this is intended to be an update this evening, and at this point, there are no changes happening to school start times in East Penn for the 2019-20 school year. At this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Erica Bagley, who is an East Penn resident, as well as a parent of East Penn student, and she's also a professor of psychology at Muhlenberg College. And she's going to share with us the initial part of the presentation in which she's focusing on that topic of adolescent sleep, as well as the research that we have learned nationally as well as locally from our survey. Dr. Bagley.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Everybody can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So what I have for you guys tonight is really a presentation where I'm sort of reviewing and trying to provide a foundation in terms of what we know about adolescent sleep, some problems around adolescent sleep, and really sprinkle in some of the findings that we have from the surveys that we sent out in May and June. So if you don't mind, I guess if you could hold questions until the end so I can kind of get the foundation out there, and I think hopefully any questions you have will quickly be clarified through the presentation. All right, so I think one of the most basic things we might ask ourselves in terms of adolescent sleep is how much sleep do adolescents really need? And there seems to be some misperceptions maybe about how much sleep adolescents actually need. The thought that they are no longer really kids who are growing might be out there. The truth of the matter is that adolescents need just as much sleep as kids, and arguably at moments in development might need more. But what researchers have kind of concluded is that, generally speaking, somewhere between 8 and 10 hours a night is what adolescents need for optimal functioning. And you might ask, well, how do they get those numbers? A lot of them are just sort of based on population studies, but they've done some experimental research more recently because of this topic of adolescent sleep becoming so prominent. And so they've done some experimental laboratory research where they bring adolescents into a laboratory and sleep deprive them at different levels, and then kind of look at when do they have optimal functioning. And so those studies kind of conclude somewhere around 9.3 hours is in general what adolescents need for optimal functioning. That finding, along with the population studies of, showing how much sleep adolescents are getting, really led the CDC, the American Academy of Pediatrics, National Sleep Foundation, all to kind of wave red flags about this problem of sleep deprivation in adolescents in America. So the CDC, sort of acknowledging this problem, went out to really conduct a nationwide study and look at how much sleep adolescents are getting. And this study back in 2015, they found 6 out of 10 middle school students and 7 out of 10 high school students were not getting at least 8 hours of sleep per night on school nights. And so here's sort of the first bit of data from our surveys. And what we found was actually middle school students, about 34% are not getting their required minimum of 8 hours, but 79% of high school students are not getting that minimum of 8 hours. And again, really the 8 is sort of the bare minimum we're talking about in terms of helping adolescents get to that point of sort of optimal functioning. And when I'm talking about optimal functioning, what am I talking about? Sleep is really quite fundamental for a number of systems in the body, both in terms of health. So we know, for example, the immune system is really hurt when adolescents and humans in general aren't getting enough sleep. There's also quite a bit of literature linking obesity and lack of sleep in adolescents. We also know that during adolescence, the body is still growing quite a bit. And the truth of the matter is that a lot of that growth is happening while adolescents are asleep. They really need that time for their bodies to grow. And not only are their bodies growing, but their brains are growing. So one of the things we have come to know is that there's that prefrontal cortex region of our brain that helps us with making really good executive decisions is really going through a growth spurt during adolescence. And so sleep is really fundamental to helping that happen in the ways that it needs to. Of course, for here, school district, cognitive functioning is really important in terms of thinking about adolescents and their need for sleep. So one of the things we know, for example, is that memory is really affected by lack of sleep because we do what we call memory consolidation while we are sleeping. And so the things that an adolescent is learning during the day, those things are sort of processed and filtered through and become real memories that are going to be used the next day in school. And when adolescents aren't getting enough sleep, they aren't able to sort of make use of all of that important thing, all those important things happening while they're sleeping. And then finally, sleep is really important in terms of helping adolescents regulate their emotions. So there's been quite a bit of research linking adolescent sleep deprivation with mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, and also externalizing behavior problems. So when we look at East Penn, we asked adolescents from middle school into high school using a standardized score for sleepiness. We asked them about, there was a variety of questions they were asked in terms of a checklist of how often are you experiencing these symptoms of sleepiness. And what we found was that particularly into the high school years, we see quite a bit of sleepiness being reported by adolescents in the district. That is sort of paralleled with the fact that both teachers, parents, and students are all saying, because these were sort of self-report, to what extent do you think sleepiness is affecting learning, behavior, and well-being? And teachers, parents, and students overwhelmingly reported that they agreed that this was affecting what's going on in the classroom and what's going on within people's homes. The other important thing to note is that sleepiness is affecting the extent to which adolescents are getting to school. So when asked high school students and middle school students, about 24% of high school students reported that they've been late 3 or more times during the school year because of sleepiness, 20% for middle school. 18% of high school students and 10% of middle school students reported being absent 3 or more times because of sleepiness. In addition to getting to school, we also know that a lot of adolescents are driving. And in our survey, 36% of the students who drive reported they are driving while sleeping. which is quite dangerous, arguably just as bad as drunk driving. So now that I've kind of given you an idea of, how much adolescents need sleep and why they need it, how does it work? And one way in which we might look at this question of, well, if adolescents need more sleep, they should just go to bed earlier, right? And the truth is, what we know about how sleep functions and how sleep is maintained, particularly during adolescence, it's really not that simple. There are a couple things really basic that I just want to explain quickly about how sleep works. So the best model we have for understanding how sleep works is this, what we call the two-process model of sleep. Essentially, we have two systems that regulate our sleep, that help us feel sleepy and tell us when it's time to go to sleep, and then tell us when it's time to wake up. These systems ideally are working together. So we have the circadian system, which is, giving us, sunlight is helping us give all these cues about when is it daytime, and the light gets darker, and we start hearing, the nighttime's bird chirping, and we start to feel tired, right? So we have these systems that are sort of set by very common rhythms in life, and that's our circadian system. We also have what we call the sleep drive system, which is essentially the idea that we have a certain amount of energy to use, and we are going to use it up, and at the point at which it is sort of exhausted is when we feel tired. Ideally, again, those two systems are working together so that the time at which your body is releasing melatonin, bringing down cortisol levels, it's also the same time when your body is tired. That's great. It works for some of us really well. During puberty, however, there's some changes to both of these systems that we've come to understand, and it really makes it harder for adolescents to just fall asleep earlier. And so one of the things we know, for example, is that sleep pressure system really builds more slowly in postpubertal adolescence. And we also know that those circadian rhythms are shifted as well, something we call the circadian shift, that really turn those morning lark kids, elementary school kids, into night owl middle school and high school students. And so a lot of people have experienced this, and there are real biological processes behind why this is happening. There's also social changes happening, right, in the adolescent's life. There are a lot more academic demands being placed on them, lots more responsibilities, both at home, maybe a job. There's a lot more things in the world that are exciting them and that are distracting them, right? Socializing being one of them, but also opportunities for engaging in extracurricular activities and sports. While all of this stimulation is happening for adolescents, it's also interesting to note it's the same time around when parents are really relinquishing a lot of control around sleep. So, a lot of parents are no longer holding their kids to bedtimes any longer. In our survey, we actually found that about half of middle school students had reported having a bedtime before 10 o'clock, but less than 25% of high school students did. The other thing that might be floating around there in terms of thinking about how do we deal with this problem might be, well, adolescents can just, catch up on sleep on the weekends, right? Or maybe just take some extra naps. The truth is that idea and actually engaging in those behaviors can have negative effects in the long run. Catch-up sleep doesn't really work. For one thing, if you are sleepy in your first period class, catching up on sleep the night later is not going to somehow make you awake what you missed last first period, right? So we can't go backwards in time in terms of reviving ourselves. But there's also other reasons why catch-up sleep isn't a great idea. One of those is a problem we call social jet lag. So what we see oftentimes in adolescents is that the ways in which they are sleeping during weekdays, school nights, and weekends are quite different. They're really sleeping in on the weekends and catching up, maybe, if they think, on that sleep. However, what that does, essentially, is create a situation where they have gone to a different time zone on the weekend. And as many parents know, what that means for a Sunday night or a Monday morning is something very very painful, because trying to get back to that time zone that is your weekday life is really challenging. So we have some data, actually national data and East Penn data, that looks at this issue of the difference between the kinds of sleep adolescents are getting during weeknights and weekends. So the top left here, I'm sorry, it's hard to see, but essentially what you see is the top line is the hours of sleep that adolescents are getting when it is a weekend, and the red line is what they are getting when it's a school night, and across the bottom you're seeing 6th grade to 12th grade. And so that's national data. We have the same data from our study this June, and we really see the same pattern. So what you see, sort of that top orange line, is the sleep that adolescents are getting on the weekends, and that's somewhere around 9.3 hours, actually. And the sleep that adolescents are getting on school nights, and you see that sort of decline across the 4 years of high school in particular. So you've got a challenge really created by the ways in which adolescents are dealing with their sleepiness. So that this catch-up sleep that's happening on the weekends is really kind of putting their systems out of sync with one another. The other thing that adolescents will do, oftentimes, and adolescents in East Penn, is engage in napping behavior. And while napping might seem like a rather innocuous way to deal with being tired, it's not necessarily the best way to approach this problem. One of the things we know, for example, is that REM sleep, that one that's really important for memory consolidation that I talked about, that happens while we are sleeping, the amount of REM sleep that you get across the night increases as you are asleep longer. So we're at the very top in the first few hours, percentage-wise, what you're getting in terms of REM sleep is very small, and it grows across the night. That's why we need continuous sleep. That's why we need sleep that is not interrupted. So napping, and just adding the 2-hour nap you got to the 5 hours you got last night, is not really the same as getting 7 hours of sleep. The other problematic thing that adolescents often do to engage themselves and sort of stimulate themselves to get out of feeling so sleepy is stimulant use. And we know that stimulant use is on the rise in terms of both energy drinks, caffeine, and other drugs that adolescents may be taking for other reasons. They may be using those to help keep themselves awake. So clearly, stimulant use during the day, it's not a good habit to start in high school. It has its own health consequences, and of course there's abuse potential there. So from our survey of East Penn students, this is specifically looking at high school students, they reported quite a bit that they are battling sleepiness during the day. And so we asked them questions about what they do in order to deal with their sleepiness during the day. About a quarter reported napping during the school week, and about a quarter also reported consuming caffeinated beverages to keep up with their sleepiness. Another 18% also reported eating sugary foods, and that link to obesity is sort of part of that bigger picture. So as we put all of this together, I want to sort of impress upon you that adolescent sleep is a very complex thing. Sleep in humans is complex. What helps us fall asleep, what helps us maintain good quality sleep, what gets us up in the morning and going and not feeling sleepy during the day, all of that is complex. There's been quite a bit of research really trying to understand what sort of drives adolescent sleep, because we have recognized the problem. As I've tried to sort of summarize, there's a variety of biological mechanisms, particularly around the time of puberty, that are really shaping adolescent sleep. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in terms of adolescent lives, including these psychosocial pressures that are up here, that really affect how much time adolescents have to sleep. But on the other end of the equation, in terms of what time adolescents are waking up, one of the things that we know really dictates the time at which adolescents are going to wake up is what time they have to start school. And so thinking about sort of where school start time fits into this larger picture, it might be a point of intervention. So many school districts have kind of looked at this issue across the country. There has been movements around school start time changes. Dating back to the early 90s, people have been sort of playing around with this idea. And so there have been quite a few school districts that have done this, where we can now look at the data from all of those schools and say, you know, what is the impact of school start time changes? And I can't pretend that for every minute you give an adolescent in the morning, they're going to take it for sleep, but the majority of the research shows that about a 1-hour delay in school start time equates to about a 45-minute gain in sleep for adolescents. Compare that to most anything else we know in terms of an intervention, it's a pretty large effect size. The RAND Corporation, which is a big think tank sort of in DC, they also took a look most recently at a number of school districts that made changes to school start time. They were really looking at sort of the economic analysis of this situation, because some school districts, this requires some upfront cost. What they concluded was that within 3 years, any school start time changes were cost neutral. And they came to that conclusion by way of a couple things here that I have listed. First was a reduction in motor vehicle crashes, hearkening back to that sleepy driving thing. Improvement in test scores in school districts, reduction in delinquency and tardy rates, and improved graduation rates. So when school districts have made these changes, every school district seems to have its own sort of quirks in terms of what is going to work best, but overall these are sort of the kinds of improvements that you probably could expect to see. And I'd say, you know, overall, walking away from this data, I think if we went into it saying, here's a lot of national data, where does East Penn fall? Largely, we look like the rest of the nation. And so when the CDC and the American Pediatric Association is raising red flags, they're raising red flags about this community too. I mean, it's the same problem. Yeah.
So as a follow-up to that outstanding research presentation regarding adolescent sleep, I wanted to just provide the community with an update in terms of what our task force has envisioned and has planned for the next steps. One of the first things that we plan to do is expand our membership a bit, because in doing research, we know that there are several obstacles, and as part, some of those key obstacles would be looking at transportation. Another key obstacle would be our secondary students' after-school activities in which they're involved, whether they're extracurricular activities, athletic activities. We know that many of our secondary students have jobs as well. So in thinking about those obstacles, we know that we need to expand membership in our task force so that we can actually begin to brainstorm how we might address those different obstacles. Another key piece for us, beyond just expanding our membership, is to actually educate the East Penn community in terms of what our task force has learned about adolescent sleep. And so certainly a first step was to bring the information here to the board and the public this evening, but we've certainly talked about the need to be proactive and continue to share this information with parents, students, teachers across the community. Another key piece for us, particularly as we look at the first half of the upcoming school year, is to analyze the use of time at the secondary level. And what I mean by that, or why we believe that's a critical first step, is because it's important for us to look at the number of minutes for which our secondary students are here with us. Many people make the assumption that if we are ever in the position of investigating a later school start time, possibly by an hour, some people then make the assumption that that means that the school day must then end an hour later. And we believe that the use of time analysis at the secondary level is really critical so that we can see how those minutes are being used, which of them are dedicated to core instruction, how many minutes do we have between classes, how many minutes do we have for lunch, so that we can really maximize instructional time and have a really firm understanding in terms of if we as a school community make a decision to move forward with adjusting start times, what does that start and end time actually look like? So we envision that that would also be work that we would do coming into the next school year. And as I also mentioned again, really developing and having a firm understanding of what those obstacles are, as well as possible solutions to each of those obstacles. When we talked about education, another way in which we can continue to educate and communicate with the East Penn community is through our online presence. And so we have, as well as a committee, a plan to develop a web page in which we can continue to update our community, whether it's with the presentation, sharing survey results, just to increase that transparency with the task force work, so that ultimately there's no surprises with regard to where this work may eventually end up. And then, as always, our plan would be, tentatively, we're saying mid-next school year, in which we would come and report back to the board and the community regarding what did we find about that use of time, and then what have we identified in terms of some of those obstacles, what those potential solutions would be, so that we can continue the discussion in terms of looking at our secondary start times and making a decision if it's right for the East Penn community to consider a change. Thank you.
Should we have Ms. Bagley, and for you?
Absolutely. Any questions? And the other piece that I wanted to mention is we are very fortunate to have multiple members of our task force here. Mrs. Whitman, Mr. Povolitis, Dr. Kirez, Ms. Armstrong, Ms. Shearer is here as well. So certainly many members of our task force are here as well.
Board members have questions? Mr. Smith?
I had two quick questions. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was fantastic. Slide number 6, that was where you mentioned the sleepiness score.
Yeah.
I'm just curious what that score means. Is that a percentage? Is that a raw score?
So there's 8 questions, and the strongest response would be so this sort of so if you had responded that the sleepiness problem had occurred almost always to you, you would have reported a 4. So that would have been like a top score of 32 if you said every time, all the time, for every item. That being said, this where we're hovering in terms of adolescent sleepiness is at the level that, this isn't a clinical scale, but certainly this is at the level that would be indicative of some problems with sleep deprivation. So they are saying that they frequently, to many of the items, are experiencing those problems.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the second question I had, and this may be one of our next steps, you mentioned, I think it was the last slide, that 1 hour of delay equals or leads to, according to the research, 45-minute increase in total sleep time. Did the research say anything about how districts and communities approach the challenges of extracurriculars and sports and after-school activities? Did it say anything about how they were able to push things back and still get that benefit in sleep without messing everything up? Or is that still a little bit early for where we're at right now?
Quite frankly, to be honest with you, the psychologists are less interested. But I think actually, when we went to Radnor, for example, I think reaching out to other school districts that have made some of these changes has been really informative in terms of, and I think there are quite a few good models of how to make some changes. There are also bad models. So, for example, I know in Rhode Island, in Providence, Rhode Island, they made a big change, and they ended up walking it back because they didn't think through all of the challenges ahead of time. So I really sort of applaud the ways in which sort of we've approached this in terms of being really careful about thinking about what are the challenges, because the school districts, I think, that have jumped into it have ended up and having to jump themselves back.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? I had 2 questions. One for you, Dr. Bagley. You mentioned a number of school districts or high schools are making changes. Do you have an idea of what percentage of high schools are have start times in line with the, is it 8:30, the?
8:30 is sort of the recommendation of the
Recommended.
American Pediatric Association, yeah. I don't know percentage-wise. I know that there are certainly websites that are sort of organizations that are promoting school start time changes that are actually doing a pretty good job of sort of cataloging who's making changes per state. We were just reading recently that New Jersey has passed a law to look at school start time changes, and they've implemented trying to pilot it in at least 5 school districts. So, I mean, I think it's certainly, there's movement. When we went to Radnor too, they were talking about this at the state level too, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. And Mrs. Campbell, one of the, what slide was that? One of the slides talked about multiple pressures that are shortening sleep, and I know the task force is looking at school start times, but is there any thought of looking at, maybe in conjunction with the, how the school time is being spent, looking at homework or coordination between different classes as a way to reduce the pressure on students at home?
Well, certainly, when we talk about use of time, I think homework would play into that discussion, yes. And actually, as well, in our survey, that was something that was mentioned by both parents as well as students in terms of, sort of this notion of, if we look at adjusting school start time, we have students who are potentially ending school later and still having what some might describe as a significant amount of work that they have to do at home. So it really is just looking at all of those practices in general.
And we actually have, I mean, I didn't put it as part of this presentation because it's actually kind of complex, but we have a lot of data that we collected about how adolescents are spending their time after school that we can kind of dig into a little bit more as well.
Okay.
And there was a comment or some brief discussion just a minute ago about some things happening at the state level. And just to remind the board that it was in fall of 2018, so just this past school year, in which the PA Senate approved a joint state government commission who was charged with establishing an advisory committee specifically to study this concept of adolescent sleep and start times. And so we're expecting a report from that commission in mid-October 2019. So that would also be another, piece of information that can certainly add to our body of research.
Any other questions? Mr. Champagne?
Would it be possible, Dr. Bagley mentioned there's a number of websites that are kind of collating a lot of this data about what the districts that have implemented this. Could we get a list of where those are and what?
Absolutely.
That would be very helpful to
Yep.
get a little more feedback.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
I think that would also be information that we can continue to populate on our website so that we're sharing that information with the community as well.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Dr. Munson?
I have a question, but I wanted to actually respond to one of the questions you asked, because I had this vague sense that I had seen the answer to the number of school districts that do this. I don't actually know the answer, but the Centers for Disease Control has studied this in terms of students, and it's less than as of 2014, it's less than 1 in 5 American middle and high school students have a start time 8:30 or later, which is the recommendation of the major medical groups.
As of 2014.
I'm sorry?
As of 2014?
As of 2014. I suspect it's a little bit more now because there has, this is not a wheel that requires reinvention. But it's also, some of their finding was also that it varies a lot by states. So there's some states where almost all school districts are already 8:30 or later, and there's some where there's almost none.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Dr. Bagley.
Thank you, and thanks to all members of the committee who are also here tonight.
Moving on, we have a report card update.
We do. We have an update of some significant programmatic advancements going on at the elementary level. And so Mr. Povolitis is going to give a brief introduction to the 2 presentations. I'll emphasize, and I'm sure he's going to emphasize as well, the single introduction is meant for brevity, not at all to say that the 2 presentations are have a relationship to each other. They are two separate presentations.
All right, good evening. So as Mrs. Campbell said, we have two more presentations tonight, an elementary report card update, and then a full-day kindergarten program update. I will introduce both presentations, as was mentioned, so the transition between the presentations is more efficient. The goal of the first presentation is to provide an update regarding our revised elementary report card. Thank you to the many teachers, administrators, and parents for their efforts to get us to this point. Here tonight to represent the report card committee and provide you with an update are Michelle James, our supervisor of elementary curriculum in the STEM subjects, Erin Murphy, our supervisor of K-12 curriculum and instruction in humanities, and Rebecca Champion, our instructional support teacher at Willow Lane Elementary School. And then the goal of our second presentation, which will immediately follow the first one, is to provide an update and some reflection regarding first-year implementation of the full-day kindergarten program. Once again, many thanks to our parents, teachers, and administrators who helped make our first year a success. For tonight's update, Erin Murphy and Michelle James will be presenting again, and joining them will be Mary Ann Stella, kindergarten teacher at Alberta Elementary. So at this time, I'll ask our presenters to please come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I am Michelle James. I am elementary supervisor of CNI for STEM and professional development. And if you recall, I was here with you earlier this year talking to you about the report card and the progress that we have made to date. So tonight is really just another overview. I'm going to briefly revisit some of the things I talked about, and then you will have a chance to look at our elementary report cards. So as you recall, with any good committee work, you should always start with why, and that's really important to us because it grounds all of our decisions. So when we started with why with our committee, we talked about the mission and we talked about our vision. We also talked about our beliefs with assessment and grading practices and how they currently align to our report card and how we feel that we needed to make some changes in order to better align our practices with what we're doing in the classroom as to what we're reporting to parents. And finally, in today's age when we have so much technology, we talked about parent communication touch points. We were cognizant of the idea that we can communicate and offer feedback to kids and to parents and families almost instantaneously. So how can we capitalize on this new report card to provide feedback for student progress and student learning? The committee ultimately ended with the report card purpose that you see on the screen right now, and it was extremely important for us to consider all of our stakeholders, our families, our students, and the teachers. Tonight I'm sharing with you what our report cards look like, but understand that there is more layers to this coming in terms of effective communication to all of our other stakeholders as well. Ultimately, we thought about the purpose and we looked through the lens of a parent and a family member, we looked through the lens of a student, and we look through the lens of a teacher. Those three bullets are what we deemed most important. We believe it's important to report academic progress. It's important for us to report behaviors that promote learning, and it's also extremely important for us to reflect on what we've done so far, and then how do we inform our future learning goals, whether it be a student learning or a teacher instructing.
The report card committee that met was comprised of parent representatives, teachers from each grade level and subject area, and administrators. The committee worked to create a report card that reflected the wishes and interests of all of our stakeholders. Among these was a report card that reported on student learning and progress rather than grades, was easy to read and understand, and that was shared with families in a printed format. In an effort to report on student learning, the new report card is standards-based. As stated in the report card purpose, information on the new report card includes the achievement of specific learning goals based on PA academic standards in math, ELA, and social studies, and science goals based on the next generation science standards. In addition, the new report card includes categories that report on behaviors which promote learning, such as citizenship, work habits, future-ready skills, the inquiry process, and fine motor skills. These academic and behavioral reporting areas will be used to guide future learning and instruction. The new report card will provide teachers with text boxes to write both behavioral and academic comments. Giving teachers the space to write these comments will allow teachers the ability to share social and emotional developments, specific areas of academic success and need, and to report on the growth of the whole child. Additionally, a shift to trimesters rather than quarters will provide time for teachers to get to know and understand their students before the first reporting period and then in subsequent reporting periods. As a committee, it was an intentional decision to simplify the reporting categories and provide a printed copy of the report card to families in an effort to increase accessibility and communicate with our partners in learning. I want to take an opportunity to share with you a visual representation of the new report card, which is linked in your presentation. You may have noticed that there are 3 different versions of the report card. Grade level bands were created in an effort to meet the developmental needs of children, as well as the distinct reporting needs of each grade level. The kindergarten and first grade report card, viewed here, includes the academic scale, behavioral scale, and comment boxes. The second and third grade report card builds upon that of the kindergarten and first grade report card. And the fourth and fifth grade report card, which is our most comprehensive report card, includes reporting areas for all subject areas, as well as an area for our specialists. Accompanying the report card will be a physical insert or cover sheet that provides further explanation and expands upon the terms used in our new report card. This insert is the physical reminder that our new report card is aligned to our district mission and vision. It was our goal as a committee to develop a report card that reflected both the skills and attributes identified in the portrait of an East Penn graduate and that met the needs of all of our stakeholders.
As I shared with you in the past, our schedule was intentional. We picked several different times of the school year to educate and build capacity, not only with our committee, but also with our teachers. Our teachers have been learning about standards-based grading for the past year and a half, and we're now coming in August, we will work with standards-based grading and Power School. So they will learn how to use the grade book and how to enter their standards-based grades into the grade book. We also have plans for Meet the Teacher Night, where all schools will receive a message that is consistent across the district. We'll provide teachers collaboration time so that they can work together to understand and better report on student progress. Finally, you will also notice that we have 3 parent information nights planned. September 26th will be at Lincoln, October 1st will be at Willow Lane, and November 18th we will be at Shoemaker. Again, these dates were purposeful in that the first date will be right after all of the Meet the Teacher nights have been completed, so if parents have more questions or would like to learn more, they can certainly attend Willow Lane, or Lincoln or Willow Lane. And then the November 18th date is right before report cards will be issued. So that, again, is intentional so that parents can be up to speed when they receive their child's report cards. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge some of the people in the room tonight. We have many report card members here tonight who came willing, wanting to collaborate, open-minded, with a growth mindset, understanding that all of the decisions we made centered around our students. Thank you. If you have any questions?
Dr. Munson?
Thank you for all the hard work that you've put into this, and it certainly looks like there's a lot more useful information on these models, in these model report cards than I know exist in the current ones. When is the last time the district updated its elementary level report card system?
2012, 2013, 2012.
Okay, so it hasn't been really that long. Do you, I guess I have a couple of questions about, I guess mainly one is the report cards that you've presented here, are these like mock-ups, or is this what it's actually going to look like?
They are drafts from the IU. So they are currently putting these into their PowerSchool system, but they should look very close to what you're seeing.
Okay. I mean, one question I had is, what do you, maybe this just stems from my sort of deep-seated skepticism of using standards in such a deeply integrated way. Standards change with remarkable rapidity in the education world. Does the district have a plan in place for when the standards change, we can automatically change our report card, or how are standard changes going to be handled?
If you notice, we used reporting categories. So when you see foundational skills, for example, are something, phonics, word study, those kinds of things that, while the standard wording may change a little bit, we are still teaching kids to read in grades K through 3, well, really through grade 5. And the standards of mathematical practice, which you also see on there, those are just good instructional practice strategies that we would use.
Yeah, and I understand that. I think that that's useful, but at the same time, I mean, I think standards still do change, including the categories. I mean, the one on that same report card that comes to my mind is, there's been a pretty big shift in separating informational, from what you're calling informational text, from literature. And I know that the district has spent a fair bit of time and effort making sure that we're updating our curriculum and updating our teaching so that students are getting enough of both of those. What do we do when those two categories turn into 3, or the world of reading is divided in some different way? Standards is just simply not reflected in the categories we have.
I would say if we come to that crossroads, it would be our responsibility really to re-look at what we've done and make any adjustments if necessary. In fact, in 2012, that's exactly what we did. We had our report card and we went and made a few adjustments to the report card based on the new standards. But really our hope is to really focus on our mission, vision, and portrait of a graduate, and how do we get our students